Hello, lovelies. Welcome back to my channel. Cory here with Wilder Woman, and today we are doing a 31 Days of Tarot Challenge video. You guys know the drill with these. Information is down in the description box below. And today's prompt is, what was the card that was hardest for you to get when you were learning tarot, and how do you feel about that card now? This one was kind of hard for me. As far as the major arcana goes, with my love of mythology and studying the hero's journey, and I kind of feel like the Fool's journey mirrors that quite a bit. So a lot of the concepts and the messages in those major archetypes and the major arcana were easier to grasp in the beginning when I was learning and going through my tarot journey. Also, the associations with the suits, that was the concept I could understand. But ironically, the suit that gave me the most trouble when I was learning, mind you, I'm trying to remember how my practice was several years ago, you guys. So bear with me, especially after having 4 children. They ate up a lot of the brain cells. So all my synapses are probably not firing as fast as some of y'all. Sorry, that was kind of a tangent there. As you know, I happen to love tangents in these videos and hate editing, which is why they're left in there for you to enjoy. But I'm trying to remember aspects about my practice from like 15, 16 years ago. So bear with me here. But if I remember right, the suit that I struggled with the most was actually my own. I told you guys that I am a big fire sign, but for the longest time I really only knew my sun sign, and being a cusp. I happened to be born on a day where you might consider it to be either the last day of Leo or first day of Virgo. Predominantly, people say it's the first day of Virgo. I always considered myself an earth sign and ran with that until I had my chart done, and I looked at my chart and I was like, there is a shitload of fire here, and like one earth sign, which is kind of half because of the cusp. At least as far as like the planets go. So yeah. I was like, what the F, y'all? It's funny because looking back on it now, you know, all of this fire, I sit here and I think with the wand suit, I should have prefaced that, with the wand suit being associated with fire, the element of fire, and passion and creativity, all of these things that are naturally in my personality. I think part of the reason why I had such a struggle with this suit's concepts was that I was in it, if that makes sense. I was too close to it. This is something that's within me, and we always spot things in other people before we spot them in ourselves. So understanding the concept of, you know, the pentacles and earth and responsibility and finance, and that made sense to me because there were folks around me that were heavy in those traits and with that element of earth. And so it was like, okay, I get that. And then going to swords, being in your head all the time with air, thought, truth, you know, stripping away the bullshit for the most part, because, you know, air, to the point, you know, swords, that I could get my head around. And then moving on to cups, emotion, whimsy, dreaming, that sea energy with the cups. I could understand that too. And maybe it was just because, you know, with fire being too close to it, having too much of it. I was like, I don't get it. I don't understand. And the reason why I have these 4 cards out is at least in the beginning, you know, when I was 16, 15, 16, and working with my first tarot deck, and because it was the Celtic Dragon Tarot by DJ Conway, if any of you guys, I don't have the deck still, I passed it on to my nephew, so unfortunately I can't share the images, but if any of you have ever worked with that deck, the imagery, because you're dealing with dragons, isn't traditional in the Rider-Waite-Smith imagery. So I relied heavily on the guidebook. And court cards were a struggle for me. And maybe it's because I was so young, and just not really kind of exposed to, what do I want to say, you guys? I think what I struggled with was the progression. In seeing the archetypes in you know, each of these, where, you know, yes, pages oftentimes reference messages. They're about bringing news, whether that news be good or bad news, you know, and how you interpret that. And also, you know, new experiences and beginnings. Seeing within each of these cards a natural progression. One of the things that finally kind of clicked for me as I was reading and starting to develop that, which, you know, I pulled the Shadowscapes Tarot out, but I feel like I should have pulled the Book of Shadows Tarot down here so that I could actually show you this in a progression, is that, like I said, progression of phases in your life. When I started associating these with symbology such as the triple goddess, where you have the maiden, mother, and crone, and going through these stages in your life, you know, you're at the beginning, you're starting out, there's the excitement, there's the energy, there's, you know, getting your feet wet, starting your very first job is something that I think of. And then progressing, you know, if you almost think of this like a progression of someone's career, you know, you're a novice. And then here, you get to be, you know, kind of somewhat of a journeyman, right? You know, you're still new experiences with the knights. You're still, you know, doing things, starting off, but there's action there. There's movement. You know, they're on these horses, or in the Shadowscapes Tarot, these, you know, magnificent, gorgeous beasts, and launching off, and you're making that movement. Now there's, you know, additional layers to each of the suits in the cards themselves and those archetypes, as far as being headstrong, rushing into things, but, you know, moving on your passions, taking that action, you know, in the Pentacles, being more decisive and diplomatic in the actions that you take, you know, etc. But it's still beginning, but we have a movement here. You know, we're progressing all the way up to the Queen, where at this point you're an artisan. You know, you've got a very good grip on your craft. You're moving forward. You found balance, where in the Knights, you know, you're teetering usually a bit more towards one end than the other of the spectrum. Here, you're starting, you've got a foundation under you. You're finding balance. You're really almost at the top of your game until you get to, you know, the King. And at this point, you are the culmination of your suit. You are now master of your craft and the energy that each of these brings. And I think one of the things that I struggled with the most And I kind of feel it bubbling to the surface for a lot of deck artists. Like I mentioned in the Book of Shadows Tarot, it shows one person progressing through these phases. So 2 suits have women, one woman as the page, knight, queen, and king in those positions. And then you've got 2 men, one for each of the 2 remaining suits going through page, knight, queen, and king. So it's reflecting these court cards as more of a stage, a phase, as opposed to the action, where you would see an actual position in a court. And there's been discussion in the tarot community as to whether or not court cards are antiquated. I feel like that it needs to be there, but if they end up getting relabeled, I don't really see that as kind of a bad thing, because one of the things that I know that I struggled with was when these popped up, originally I was taught that, especially with the queen and king, that if these popped up, you were talking about a male authority figure or female authority figure or figure of influence, but male or female according to the gender of the label of the court cards. And I struggled with that because in a lot of my readings, the position would pop up and I would sit there and I would go, okay, this is supposed to be a female in your life, that has these attributes. And, in reading for my friends in the earlier stages, in high school especially, and they would sit there and go, that doesn't describe any woman I know in my life. And I would go, okay, well, think about it. The court cards were always my Achilles heel in working with the tarot, especially in high school when I had started reading it. I think because of the gender roles. And as we start moving into there, there's a lot of discussion, especially in the US right now, with a lot of certain groups' rights being taken away and infringed upon or never provided to begin with. There's this struggle, I think, not just for identity at an individual level, but as a societal level, and pushing gender boundaries. And, what is gender? What do gender roles mean? How are they applied to people, especially when, if we think about ourselves on a soul level, that really, a soul is somewhat genderless. And because everybody, everywhere, has both masculine and feminine energies, just in different amounts, why do there need to be gender assignments in the court cards? And I really stripped that completely out of the way that I was reading. It took me a few years, but it was probably, I would say I was probably 23, maybe. It was around the time that I got married. And was very then comfortable with who I was as a person, and who I was as a woman, and how that identity, came about for me. I was like, fuck it. Why does there need to be an assignment? And the more tarot books that I absorbed, because again, in the beginning, I didn't necessarily have any books on tarot. When I started off, I relied solely on learning from the guidebooks of the decks. And you're looking at it from the writer and artist perspective. You know, you're not looking at it from traditional, you know, there's elements of traditional meanings, but everybody brings their own optical lens to the guidebook that they're writing, which I think is, you know, now that I have so many decks, it's awesome to see so many points of view and incorporate all of that into my practice. This video is going on way longer than I wanted it to. But circling back around, trying to desperately. Bottom line is, it was the court cards, not just one card in particular. It was court cards. And really most of it stemmed from the gender roles that I thought in the beginning of my practice were needed to be assigned to the cards. And when I removed those, that now if a gender comes up to me in the message I'm downloading from Spirit, I'll say, okay, you know, like for example, if I get the Knight, right, which is typically depicted as a male, but if I get the Knight and I go, okay, intuitively, Spirit is telling me that this is a female in your life, but she's at this stage. And, you know, here's the energy of this person likely, and, you know, etc. And then it usually ends up clicking for the person. But a lot of the times I'll even just say, you know, if I don't get a specific gender from Spirit, then I'll say this is a person at this stage or with these attributes, etc. And sometimes even depending on the position of the spread, it's not a person at all. It's just that energy that's there and present, which takes on a whole different meaning. Or if it ends up being the stage that the querent is in, you know, I've pulled messages for myself of where am I at in this stage, and I get the King, and I'm like, okay, well, I don't identify as a dude, so again, it's, you get the messages that you need to get, but fitting yourself into a specific box or fitting your reading into a specific box is unnecessary. Sometimes it's unhealthy. But it's wholly unnecessary. You can read however, you know, you're being guided to read. And wherever you're having a hang up in your practice, take a look at that, because maybe it's something in your reading that you're trying to intuitively draw towards and you're resisting it because of some hang up or false rule that you've made up in your mind that's actually not valid for you. And those gender assignments, traditional gender assignments, aren't valid for me. So that was a pretty big breakthrough for me as I progressed into my tarot practice. So, lovelies, what was the card or cards that were your biggest hang up? If you're still early in your practice, fantastic. What are you struggling with now? Because I'm sure a lot of us have videos on YouTube that could help break through those boundaries. If you've been struggling with court cards, my hope is that this video has helped you in some way. Or if you've struggled in the past, maybe you can relate to my experience with the court cards. Either way, I really hope you enjoyed this video, lovelies. I will be catching you in tomorrow's video. But until then, blessed be.